Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker with A Healthcare Z, and this is the How to Get into Medical School podcast. Now, I am going to start off this podcast with some reverse logic, and I'm going to talk about ways that you can really screw up getting into medical school. And in many respects, getting into medical school is a lot about not screwing up. So let's talk about how you can screw up getting into medical school. Okay, screw up number one is going to a highly competitive college where you are towards the bottom of the spectrum in terms of intelligence of students at that college. And the reason that is a way to just screw up going to medical school is because most colleges and universities grade on a curve, which means that your grade is really relative to your peers. And so if you're surrounded by peers who are much smarter than you, well, then you're totally screwed. And I will tell you that I went to Northwestern for undergrad, and whether that's a really good school or an okay school or a not so great school, it depends upon where you stand. But I was at least able to be reasonably above average on the curve, and sometimes I get like 78% on a percentage basis on my organic chemistry tests, and that would be an A. Just so, like, in terms of actually knowing the material, it was like questionable, but because of my grade was in comparison to my peers, then I ended up getting an A. So I did not get into my first choice of colleges. I did not get into my second choice of colleges. Northwestern was like my third choice of colleges. So think about where you want to go to college, and it might be a blessing to not get into your number one choice, because if academically you are not above average at that college, then you're really setting yourself up for having a hard time getting good grades in undergrad. And if you have a hard time getting good grades in undergrad, you're going to have a really hard time getting into medical school. So that is one way to screw up getting into medical school. Way number two that you can screw up getting into medical school is when you are preparing for the MCAT, the medical college admissions test, is to not do gobs and gobs and gobs of practice questions. Like, that is the number one way to study for the MCAT, is to do practice question after practice question after practice question. It's more important than just quote unquote studying. So if you're given a choice, if you have like an hour with which to spend on the MCAT, and you're like, well, I could read about physics, or I could read about chemistry, or I could read about biology, and I could take notes, I could underline stuff, or I could spend an hour doing questions and literally get like 50% of the questions wrong, but then go through and read the correct answer and then learn by doing questions, I would pick the doing questions route, because the test is about doing questions, and you got to practice like you play. So if you want to do well on the questions, you need to do a ton of questions. Now, I enrolled in a Kaplan class, and it had like in-person instructions, and it had these study books that had the material in it laid out in a nice organized fashion, and that's great. But really the value of that Kaplan class was they had a ton of practice questions. And this was back in the late 90s, and so literally you had to go to it was not online, you had to go to the Kaplan Center, and you had to quote unquote check out the Kaplan practice questions, and you couldn't take the Kaplan practice questions out of the practice center. The smartphone with the camera had not been invented, so like you couldn't take any pictures of it, and so they kept their practice questions under like lock and key, because that was really like the value of it. But they had so many practice questions that I couldn't even get through all of them. And I had a person who had gotten into medical school tell me, do as many practice questions as you can. And I'm like, I'm going to do them all. And I didn't even come close to doing them all. They had so many practice questions in there that, like, I feel like it's almost impossible to do all of them. I mean, it was like, I want to say it was like thousands and thousands of practice questions. And so when it came time to do the actual questions on the MCAT, like, they weren't exactly the same, but let me tell you, they were super close. Like, they weren't worded the same, but in terms of like how they were worded was the same. In terms of the way that the answers are structured, how the answers were structured were like the same. Like, the subject matter of like the nuances of physics and organic chemistry was like the same. So it was, and I scored very well on I shouldn't say like very well, like I think I was in like the top like 20th percentile, maybe 10th percentile of MCAT scores. Now I know they've changed the scoring since I've done it, but I got a good grade on my MCAT, not because of any sort of like special ability on my own. It was only because of doing a lot of practice questions. Okay. Which brings me to point number 3 of how you can really screw up getting into medical school. And that is to think that it has to do with your intelligence. In my opinion, it does not. I'm not an incredibly intelligent person, okay? I graduated with honors from the University of Illinois College of Medicine. I did my residency in internal medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And I will tell you with a straight face that I am not smart. What I am, to a certain extent, is disciplined. So it doesn't take intelligence. It doesn't take smarts. It takes discipline. All you're doing is memorizing a ton of stuff. If you ask me to do any type of brain teaser or like a Mensa test or whatever, I'm horrible at it. Like, I am not good. You give me a Rubik's Cube, I couldn't figure it out to save my life. I can memorize stuff, and memorization takes diligence. That's all it is. It takes time and attention and focus. Your ability to get into medical school has very little to do with your quote-unquote intelligence. It has to do with your ability to spend prolonged periods of time with focus. And that's actually something that I think is very good about the pre-medical curriculum and the entire pre-medical process, is because I think to actually be a good physician, it requires prolonged, by prolonged, I mean like a 36-hour shift of prolonged concentration where your brain is literally focused on your patients for no distractions. You're not looking at your phone, you're not doing anything else, but you're thinking about your patients for 36 hours. You're not sleeping, you're probably not eating, or you're eating on the go, but you're just thinking about your patients for 36 hours straight. And, you know, that you can't do that overnight. I mean, it took years and years and years of building your ability to concentrate and focus up over time. But that's really what it involves. And so what does that specifically look like when you're in college and you're pre-med? That means that when you are studying, it's not the amount of time that you're in the library or in your dorm room, quote unquote, studying. It's literally the amount of time where your eyes are fixated on a book and you are actively learning. Okay, that is the time that counts. And you only want, in terms of your quote unquote time that you're studying, that's the only time that counts. It's not the amount of time that your butt is in a seat or sitting in the bed in your dorm room, right? It is the amount of time that is literally spent with your eyes looking at a book or taking notes. Like, that's what counts. And if you can do that, at the beginning of college, I could literally only do that for like an hour. And then by the end of college, I could do it for 4 hours. I could do a 4-hour burst of literally doing nothing but looking at a book, taking notes, whatever, for 4 hours straight. And it took me the 4 years of college to work my way up to that. But that degree of prolonged concentration is a super important skill for just being successful in medical school. I mean, medical school, again, the information in medical school is not complicated. It's just a tremendous volume. It's just a huge volume of information. And so you just have to get very good at being focused on incredibly large volumes of information. And in my opinion, that's not intelligence. Okay? You don't have to be quote unquote smart to get into medical school. You have to be mentally disciplined. And just like stamina in running, you become mentally disciplined by slowly increasing your capacity for mental discipline over time. So don't get worried about other people being smart. Who cares about that? In fact, I will tell you, the smartest people I knew in medical school got the worst grades and barely got by because they thought that their intelligence could get them by. And with a large volume of largely uncomplicated information of facts, being intelligent doesn't get you by. Prolonged concentration and focus is what gets you by. Okay? So, mistake number 1, don't be the dumbest person in your college. Mistake number 2 is don't do a lot of practice questions in preparing for the MCAT. Mistake number 3 is don't think intelligence is what gets you into medical school. It is not. It is prolonged mental concentration. Okay, what is a 4th way that you can really screw up getting into medical school? In my opinion, you can really screw up getting into medical school by getting involved in drugs and alcohol and, stuff that is we'll just call it a bad distraction, for lack of a better word. I mean, drugs, alcohol, sex, partying, you name it. I mean, if you are largely a teenager, young adult in college, and you have your hormones flowing, and that's totally okay. It's totally understandable. But if you get distracted by the world, and a lot of that world has to do with drugs, alcohol, sex, partying, blah, 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 then you're really going to screw up getting into medical school. Okay? And the question is, now I'm not trying to be some Puritan. I'm not telling you to be puritanical. But what I'm saying is I saw a lot of people who had literally 60%, more than 60%, probably closer to 75% of the students at Northwestern who were in the General College of Arts and Sciences, which was, which had all the, sciences, biology, chemistry, physics in it. It had all your social sciences, economics, sociology, psychology, had history, right? That was the college that the majority of pre-medical students were in. 75% of the entering freshman class was pre-med. And of course, not all 75% even applied or were still pre-med by the end of college, okay? Because one of the main reasons why they dropped their ambitions is because they got distracted. And so the reason why those things are distracting, there's a specific biochemical basis for this. And the biochemical basis for it is that all of these things stimulate dopamine in the brain. Okay, what else stimulates dopamine in the brain? Okay, listen, there's other things. You can't avoid dopamine in the brain totally, right? Caffeine stimulates dopamine in the brain. Video games stimulate dopamine in the brain. Sugar stimulates dopamine in the brain. But dopamine in the brain is highly addictive. And it requires more and more dopamine in order to elicit the same response. And shoot, I mentioned video games. I would totally see guys in my freshman dorm, in my sophomore dorm, who all they did all day long was play video games. And they started out pre-med, and they didn't get distracted by sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They got distracted by video games. So you have to be very careful about all dopamine producing activities, because they become highly addictive. And once they become addictive, they take over your ambition and your focus away from getting into medical school. Now, if you end up wanting to pursue something else in life, or you just feel like the quote unquote finer things in life that stimulate dopamine in your brain is what you want your life to be about, so be it. This is not a position of judgment. It's just saying that if you want to get into medical school, then you got to be very careful about the dopamine in your brain. And if you become involved in substances that are addictive and are high dopamine stimulators of your brain, then it's really going to screw up your chances of getting into medical school. Okay, next thing that will really screw up you getting into medical school is trying to do all of your pre-med science classes in the first 2 years of college. Do not do this, okay? Space it out. What do I mean? I mean, if you're going in and you don't have AP Gen Chem, you got to take Gen Chem your first year, then just take general chemistry your first year. Your second year, take organic chemistry and maybe physics. And then in your third year, take biology. Now, if you, and the next thing, I'll tell you, exceptions to that. But those classes are hard. They're weed out classes on purpose. In organic chemistry, what they call Orgo, where I went to school, or sometimes it's called OChem. I mean, that is a weed out class. At other schools like Vanderbilt, biology is their weed out class. Like, it will kill you. It is so hard. And it's hard on purpose. They want to weed these people out. And they say, oh, no, it's not a weed out class. Like, it is. It is a weed out class. Okay? So if you have let's say you have a certain amount of mental capacity, okay? The mental capacity that is required to do well in those classes in the first 2 years of college might be in excess of the mental capacity that you have. And you just have to be honest with yourself about that, and don't let pride get in the way. Like, I'll tell you, I was not smart enough to take, and then what they would try to do is they would take general chemistry in their first year, and then they would try to take organic chemistry and biology in their second year of undergrad. In my opinion, that is a huge mistake. I knew I was not going to be smart enough to do that. And then in their third year, when they're doing physics and their other classes, plus they're trying to study for the MCAT at the same time, I knew that I could not do all that. Now, I worked for 2 years between undergrad and medical school, so I didn't even take my MCAT until I was out of college while I was working, so that I could spend my nights and my weekends just studying for the MCAT and not having to worry about studying for anything else. And so I spread out the academic requirements for getting into medical school over a longer period of time to allow me to do better on them. And of course, 90% of the people listening to this podcast are going to say, well, I can do it. I'm special. I can do general chemistry and organic chemistry and physics and biology in the first 2 years of college. And I'll be honest with you, 90% of you are not special, and you cannot do that. Okay, so for the 10% of you that are, congratulations. But for the 90% of you that you aren't, then you will literally totally screw yourself into getting into medical school, because you're going to get bad grades in these classes. You have to get good grades in these classes. Now, people say, oh, well, you can still get into medical school with bad grades. Sure. We'll talk about that on another podcast. But guess what? It really helps to get good grades to get into medical school. I'm sorry. It helps. It really, really helps to get good grades to get into medical school. And one of the ways you can get good grades is to space out those ridiculously hard, because you're talking 5-day-a-week lecture plus lab, and the test and the volume of the assignments is crazy. I mean, the volume of material in our organic chemistry class in undergrad was crazy. Like, I remember looking at the assignments and I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. And because they were weeding us out, like purposefully weeding us out. So our organic chemistry professor, Dr. Coddens, like, he hated pre-med students. He was an organic chemist. Like, he was only interested in teaching people organic chemistry who actually wanted to become organic chemists. He had absolutely no interest in pre-med students who were taking organic chemistry just for the sake of getting to medical school. He couldn't stand us. So he just let loose on us. So space it out. Like, there's no rush. And if you space it out, yes, that means that you might not go to medical school as soon as you graduate from college. You might work for a year, but you can work in a lab for a year. I worked as a hospital finance consultant for a year. I loved working between between undergrad and medical school. I loved it. And you're like, well, I don't know what I would do, because all I want to do is go to medical school. Do something doctor related, healthcare related, okay? Listen. There's no rush. The average age of going into medical school isn't 22, it's 24, okay? So the average age of going into medical school is not going straight from undergrad into medical school, okay? So like you'll be normal if you don't do that, all right? So here is our final mistake that I will go through. Okay, the final mistake is choosing a major because you think it will look good on your medical school application instead of a major that you like. The most important thing about the major that you choose in college is that you like it. And the reason that you need to like it is because you need to get good grades in it. And it's really hard to get good grades in a subject matter that you don't particularly like. Therefore, I was not a biology major in undergrad. Now, here's the exception to that rule. If you like biology and you want to be a biology major and you're obsessed with biology and you love biology and that's all you want to study, then by all means, take your intro to biology class, freshman or sophomore year or whatever you're supposed to do if you're going to be a biology major or however your AP credits are. But like the vast majority of people that are pre-med and the vast majority of people that go to medical school are not biology majors. Like, so essentially, if you're a biology major going to medical school, you'll be in the minority. I was an economics major. There were tons of English majors. There were tons of psychology majors. There's philosophy majors. You major in what? Music performance. There was a trumpet player, violin player, pianist. I mean, the number of musicians that end up becoming doctors is incredibly high. Major in whatever you want to major in. You will, of course, need to take the pre-med required classes of general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, and biology. And then I was an English minor because I couldn't write. Our college had a freshman writing requirement test. You had to pass this freshman writing test if you had not taken AP English. I had not taken AP English, so I had to take this freshman writing class. I failed it. I failed the writing test, and I had to take a remedial writing class, and I had to retake the test. I think it was either at the end of my freshman year or my sophomore year. And so I said to myself, okay, if I suck so bad at writing, then I better frickin' learn how to write. And so I was an English minor, and I took all these English classes, not because I was interested in English literature. I took this Bronte Sisters class, reading like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, not because I was interested in the Bronte Sisters, but because there was a fantastic English professor, and she helped me so much with my writing. And I didn't even know there was a writing section of the MCAT. And so I scored incredibly well in the writing section of my MCAT because I was an English minor. So guess what? If you want to do well in your MCAT and you love writing and you love reading, then by all means, either be an English major or a journalism major or be some sort of major that requires you to write a lot of papers. If you're a science major, you're not going to have to write a lot of papers. And guess what? Your writing's going to stink. And your writing section on the MCAT is going to be awful. And I will tell you, the preparatory class with Kaplan was horrible at preparing you. It was good on the reading comprehension section of the MCAT, but Kaplan cannot help you with your writing, and they claim to, yada, 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 but you can't cram becoming a good writer. It takes years to become a good writer. So you need to become a good writer over the course of your 4 years of college. And however you need to accomplish that in a major, like if you're a psychology major or a sociology major or even an economics major, or a history major, you got to write a ton of papers, and that's good. Because you got to be able to write well in order to do well in those papers. And it's going to give you a ton of feedback. It's going to give you a ton of practice. So those are the ways to completely screw up getting into medical school. And if you can avoid maybe half of them, then you got a fighting chance. And this is Dr. Eric Bricker with A Healthcare Z. Thank you so much for listening.